The chains rattled in the dark, and Grace Turner froze where she stood, one bare foot still hovering above the mud. Somewhere behind the iron bars at the edge of Millbrook, something enormous had just moved. She had heard the stories her whole life, the same way every child in the village had. They said the caged giant in the old iron pit would tear apart anyone foolish enough to come near him. They said his hands alone could crush a grown man's skull. They said feeding him was a death sentence, because the moment his fingers touched food, they would close around your wrist instead. Grace had never believed everything she heard. But standing there, 20 paces from the cage, with the moon barely lighting the rusted bars, her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. She had come with a small parcel of bread wrapped in cloth, tucked under her arm like a secret. She did not fully understand why. Maybe it was the hunger she had seen on the faces of the guards who spoke about him in hushed, frightened tones. Maybe it was something else, some pull she could not name. Whatever it was, it had brought her here in the middle of the night, alone, against every warning the village elders had drilled into her since she was old enough to listen. The giant's cage sat at the far edge of town, past the last row of houses, past the fence line, where the forest began to swallow the road. Nobody built anything near it. Nobody walked that path after dark. The village had grown around the cage, the way a tree grows around a nail driven into its trunk, careful never to touch the wound. Grace took a step forward. The mud sucked at her shoes. A low sound came from inside the cage. Not a growl, not the roar she expected. It was closer to a breath, long and tired, like something enormous exhaling after holding its breath for years. She stopped again, gripping the bread tighter. Her hands were shaking now, and she hated herself for it. She had told herself, all the way from her small house on Willow Lane, that she was not afraid. She had told herself that the stories were exaggerated, that fear grows taller in the telling, the way shadows grow taller in the evening sun. But now, this close, with the smell of rust and damp stone thick in the air, her body was not listening to the calm voice in her head. She thought about turning back. She thought about the warnings from old Mrs. Whitfield, who had told her only that morning that the giant once tore through 6 armed men without breaking stride, that he had been chained here since before Grace was born, that no cage in the world could truly hold something like him, only slow him down. She thought about her brother, Nathan, who had begged her not to go anywhere near the eastern pit, not even in daylight, let alone at night. But she also thought about the sound she had just heard, that long, tired breath. It did not sound like a monster. It sounded like someone who had been alone for a very long time. Grace forced her feet to move again. The cage came into full view as she rounded the last bend in the path. It was larger than she remembered from the one time she had seen it as a child, dragged past it by her mother, with strict instructions never to look. Thick iron bars, black with age, rose from a stone foundation, sunk deep into the earth. Chains as thick as her arm ran from the bars to a heavy iron collar, and the collar disappeared into the darkness of the cage itself, where a shape lay curled against the far wall. She could not see him clearly at first. Just an outline, massive and still, folded into a space that seemed too small to hold him. His shoulders alone looked wider than the door of her house. His arms, even bent and resting, were thick as tree trunks. Grace's breath caught. This was really him, the Alpha King. The giant, they said, had once ruled over an entire clan of warriors before some terrible war ended everything and left him here, chained and forgotten, a legend the village used to frighten children into obedience. She should not be here, and yet she stayed. Slowly, carefully, she crept closer, until she stood just outside the reach of the bars. The giant did not move. His eyes were closed, or perhaps they were simply hidden in shadow. His breathing was slow and even, but something about the rise and fall of his massive chest seemed labored, as if even breathing cost him effort he could barely spare. Grace looked down at the bread in her hands. It suddenly felt like such a small, useless thing to bring. What difference could a loaf of bread make to something this size? And yet it was all she had, and it was the reason she had come. She knelt down, keeping her eyes on the shape in the cage, and set the parcel down just inside the reach of the bars, close enough that a long arm might reach it, far enough that she still had time to run if she needed to. The moment the cloth touched the ground, the giant's eyes opened. Grace's whole body went rigid. 2 eyes, pale gold in the darkness, fixed on her with an intensity that stole the air from her lungs. She did not move. She did not breathe. Every warning she had ever heard screamed through her mind at once. This was the moment. This was when the stories came true, when the hands closed around her wrist and dragged her into the dark. But he did not move either. He simply watched her, unmoving, from across the small distance between them, and in his eyes Grace saw something she had not expected to find. Not fury, not hunger for violence, something closer to disbelief, something closer to the look a person gives when they cannot quite trust what is standing in front of them, because trusting it has cost them too much before. "It's just bread," Grace whispered, though she was not sure why she felt the need to explain herself to a caged giant in the middle of the night. "I thought you might be hungry." The words hung in the cold air between them. For a long moment, nothing happened. The giant did not reach for the food. He did not speak, if he was even capable of speech. He only continued to watch her, as though waiting for the trick to reveal itself, waiting for the moment the kindness turned into something cruel. Grace realized, with a strange ache in her chest, that he was afraid of her too. That thought unsettled her more than anything the village elders had ever said. She had come here bracing herself for a monster, and instead, she found something that flinched at gentleness, the way she had flinched at his size. Slowly, carefully, one massive hand shifted beneath the chains. The iron rattled, loud in the silence, and Grace's heart jumped into her throat again. But the hand did not reach for her. It reached instead, toward the small parcel of bread resting just inside the bars. Grace watched, frozen, as fingers the length of her forearm closed gently around the cloth. Gently. Not crushing it, not tearing it apart the way the stories promised. He lifted it, as carefully as if it were something fragile, something precious, and drew it back into the shadows of the cage. For a moment, Grace forgot to be afraid at all. She heard the soft sound of cloth unwrapping, and then silence, and then the unmistakable sound of eating, slow and almost hesitant, as though he expected the food to be taken away from him at any moment. Grace sat back on her heels, watching the shadow move in the darkness, and felt something shift inside her chest. She had come here out of curiosity, or perhaps pity, or perhaps something she did not yet have a name for. She had expected fear to answer her. She had expected violence, or at the very least, indifference. What she found instead was a creature so starved for kindness that a single loaf of bread seemed to mean more to him than she could understand. She stayed there for a long while, longer than she meant to, watching the massive shape in the cage finish the bread in small, careful bites. When he finished, he did not retreat further into the shadows. Instead, he remained near the bars, his pale gold eyes finding hers again, and this time there was something new in them. Not trust, not yet, but something that had not been there before. A question. Grace did not know what to say. She had never expected to find herself here, kneeling in the mud outside a monster's cage, feeling anything close to what she felt now. She should have been terrified. Instead, she found herself wondering how long it had been since anyone had looked at him and seen something other than a threat. "I should go," she finally said, more to herself than to him. "Before anyone notices I'm gone." The giant did not respond, not with words, but something in his posture seemed to understand. He shifted back into the shadows of the cage, curling once more into that impossibly small space, though his eyes remained on her until she rose to her feet and began to back away. Grace walked home that night, with her mind racing faster than her feet. Every step away from the cage felt like leaving something unfinished behind her. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see him standing at the bars, half expecting the whole encounter to dissolve like a dream the moment she stopped looking at it. By the time she reached her house on Willow Lane, the village was still asleep, unaware that anything had changed. The candle in her window had burned low, and her brother Nathan was snoring in the next room, blissfully ignorant of where she had been. Grace slipped inside quietly, her heart still pounding, her mind replaying every second of what had just happened. She thought of the way his hand had closed so gently around the bread. She thought of the fear in his eyes, so similar to the fear she had carried with her into the dark. She thought of the years he must have spent alone in that cage, feared by everyone, trusted by no one, fed on nothing but rumors and rusted chains. Something told her this would not be the last time she visited him. She did not know yet how right she was, or how much that single loaf of bread was about to change everything the village believed about the Alpha King in the cage. She only knew that when she finally closed her eyes that night, it was not fear that kept her awake. It was the memory of those pale gold eyes, watching her as though she were the first kind thing he had seen in years. The next morning, Millbrook woke to its usual rhythms. Smoke curled from chimneys. Farmers led their animals to pasture. Children ran through the square chasing chickens that had escaped their pens. Nothing about the village suggested that anything unusual had happened in the night, and Grace intended to keep it that way. She moved through her morning chores with the same care she always used, drawing water from the well, feeding the few hens her family kept, helping her mother prepare the small stall they ran at the edge of the market. But her mind kept drifting back to the cage, to the sound of chains shifting in the dark, to the careful way enormous fingers had lifted a simple loaf of bread, as though it were the finest gift he had ever received. She wanted to go back. The thought frightened her almost as much as it pulled at her. At the market, the talk that morning was, as always, filled with warnings about the Eastern Pit. An old farmer named Edmund was recounting, for what must have been the 100th time, the story of how the giant had once broken free of a lesser cage decades ago and slaughtered an entire hunting party before he was recaptured. Grace had heard the story so many times she could recite it herself, though she had never once seen proof that it was true. No graves, no names, no witnesses who had actually seen it happen. Only the story itself, passed from mouth to mouth like a coin worn smooth from handling. She wondered, standing there listening to Edmund's booming voice, how much of what the village believed about the giant was true, and how much of it was simply fear dressed up as memory. That evening, after the stalls were packed away and her chores were finished, Grace found herself once again walking toward the eastern edge of the village, a small bundle tucked beneath her arm. She told herself she was only checking on him, only making sure the bread had truly reached him, and not simply confirmed some cruel trick the village elders would use against her. But as the cage came into view, and she saw the massive shape shift toward the bars the moment her footsteps sounded on the path, she knew the truth. She had not come to check on anything. She had come because some part of her wanted to see him again. The giant watched her approach with those same pale gold eyes, and this time, there was no confusion in them, no disbelief. Only something that looked, unmistakably, like relief. Grace knelt at the same spot as before and unwrapped the bundle, this time a bit more bread and a small portion of dried meat she had saved from her own dinner. She set it down slowly, deliberately, making sure he could see every movement of her hands. "I told you I'd be careful," she said softly, though she was not entirely sure if she was speaking to him or to herself. "I still don't know your name." The giant said nothing. Not yet. But as his hand reached for the food once more, gentle and slow, Grace felt certain of one thing. Whatever the village believed about the monster in the cage, she had already begun to see something entirely different, and she had a feeling that once she truly understood who he was, there would be no turning back to the girl who had once believed every frightened rumor whispered in the dark. By the 5th night, Grace no longer needed to remind her feet where to go. They carried her there on their own, past the sleeping houses of Millbrook, past the fence line, down the narrow path where the trees thinned and the old iron pit waited in the moonlight. She had stopped pretending to herself that these visits were accidents of curiosity. She wanted to see him. She wanted to know him. That night, she brought more than food. She brought questions. "Do you have a name?" she asked, settling onto the flat stone she had claimed as her usual seat outside the bars. "Everyone just calls you the Alpha King, or the Giant, or worse. But that can't be the only thing you've ever been called." For a long moment, there was only silence, and Grace wondered if she had pushed too far, too fast. She had grown used to his quiet, to the slow unwrapping of food, and the careful way he studied her every movement, as if still waiting for the cruelty to arrive. She had not yet heard him speak. Then, low and rough, as though the words themselves had rusted from disuse, a voice answered her. "Cale." Grace's breath caught. It was the first word she had ever heard him say, and it landed in the quiet night with more weight than she expected. She had almost begun to believe he could not speak at all, that whatever cruelty had been done to him in this cage had taken even that from him. "Cale," she repeated softly, testing the shape of it. "That's a good name. Much better than Alpha King." A sound came from him that she did not recognize at first, low and rough, until she realized with surprise that it was something close to a laugh. Quiet, unpracticed, but real. "They stopped using it," Cale said, his voice growing steadier with each word. as though speaking itself were a muscle he had not exercised in years. After the war, after they put me here, a name is for someone. I was not someone anymore, just a thing to be feared. Each ray, Grace felt something twist in her chest, at the flatness in his voice, the quiet acceptance of a fate that seemed, even to her untrained ear, deeply unfair. How long have you been here? Long enough to forget the sound of my own voice, Cale said. Long enough that I nearly believed I deserved it. Do you? Grace asked, before she could stop herself. Deserve it, I mean. Cale was quiet for a long moment, and in the dim moonlight, Grace could see him shift closer to the bars, close enough now that she could make out the details of his face for the first time. Sharp features, weathered by time and hardship, but not cruel. Not monstrous, tired, more than anything. Tired in a way that went far deeper than exhaustion. I have asked myself that question more nights than I can count, he said finally. I do not have an answer that satisfies me. Grace pulled her knees up to her chest, considering his words. Then tell me what happened. Not the story the village tells, the real one. Cale's eyes met hers, searching, as though trying to determine whether her request was genuine curiosity or simply another version of the same cruelty he had learned to expect from every visitor. Grace held his gaze steadily, refusing to look away, refusing to let him mistake her interest for anything less than sincere. It is not a short story, he said at last. I'm not in a hurry, Grace replied. And so, beneath the pale wash of moonlight, with the village asleep and unaware, Cale began to speak. He told her of a kingdom far beyond the forest that bordered Millbrook, a place of towering stone halls and warriors bred for strength beyond ordinary measure. He told her of a people called the Kindred, giants among giants, ruled by bloodlines that stretched back further than memory. He told her of his own bloodline, the line of kings, and the weight of a crown he had never asked to wear. My people were not monsters, Cale said, his voice growing quieter, more careful, as though each word cost him something. We were strong, yes, larger than the men of these lands, but strength alone does not make a person cruel. We built, we protected, we had laws and courts and celebrations beneath the stars. I was raised to lead, not to destroy. Grace listened, hardly daring to breathe, as Cale described a world so different from anything she had imagined. Not the savage horde the village stories painted, but a society, complex and full of the same joys and struggles as her own. Then what happened? She asked softly. What turned it all into war? Cale's jaw tightened, and for the first time since she had begun visiting him, Grace saw something flicker across his face that resembled genuine pain, not physical, but something older and deeper. Betrayal, he said simply. From within my own council, a man I trusted, a man I called brother though we shared no blood, convinced the smaller kingdoms that my people intended to conquer them. He spread lies faster than truth could ever hope to travel. By the time I understood what was happening, armies had already gathered at our borders. Did you fight them? I tried to stop it, Cale said, and there was an edge of old frustration in his voice now, sharp even after all these years. I sent envoys. I offered peace. I offered to open our borders, to prove we meant no harm. But fear does not listen to reason, Grace. Fear only listens to itself. Hearing him say her name for the first time sent an unexpected warmth through her chest, small and quiet, but real. The war came anyway, Cale continued. My people fought to defend their homes, nothing more. But we were larger and stronger, and every battle we won only fed the fear further. By the time it ended, my kingdom was in ruins, most of my people scattered or lost, and I was captured and brought here, to this cage, as proof that the Monster King had finally been defeated. Grace sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing the weight of everything he had shared. It was nothing like the story Edmund told at the market, nothing like the warnings Mrs. Whitfield had drilled into her since childhood. It was a story of misunderstanding compounded by fear, of a leader who had tried to prevent violence and been punished as though he had caused it. That's not what they tell us, she said quietly. They say you attacked without reason. They say you enjoy this, being feared. Coyle's pale gold eyes met hers, steady and sad. Stories are easier to believe when they do not require anyone to feel guilty, he said. It is easier to fear a monster than to question whether the monster was made by the very people who claim to fear him. Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. She thought of every warning she had ever received, every story told to frighten children into obedience, every assumption she herself had carried into this place only days before. How much of what her village believed was built on the same fear Cale described? Fear that refused to examine itself too closely, because the truth might be far more uncomfortable than the lie. "I believe you," she said finally, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. Something shifted in Cale's expression, subtle but unmistakable, like a door easing open after being sealed shut for years. "Why?" he asked, and there was genuine confusion beneath the question, as though trust were a language he had forgotten how to understand. "Because you didn't have to tell me any of this," Grace said. "You could have stayed silent. You could have let me believe whatever I wanted. Instead, you told me the truth. Even the parts that make you look weak. Even the parts where you failed to stop something terrible from happening. That's not what monsters do." Cale did not answer right away. Instead, he reached toward the bars, slowly, and Grace watched as one massive finger extended through the gap, not quite touching her, simply resting there, an offering rather than a demand. Carefully, hesitantly, Grace reached out and placed her own small hand near his finger, not quite touching either, letting the space between them shrink without fully closing it. "Thank you," Cale said quietly, "for asking the real question, instead of settling for the story everyone else already believes." Grace smiled, small and genuine, in the darkness. "I have a feeling," she said, "that I'm only beginning to understand who you really are." As she finally rose to leave that night, promising to return again soon, Grace could not shake the feeling that something important had shifted between them, something that went far beyond a shared meal, or a name spoken aloud for the first time in years. She had come to the cage seeking answers, and instead, she had found the beginning of a friendship neither of them had expected, forged in the quiet hours when the rest of the village slept, unaware that everything they believed about their caged giant was about to be tested. The rain came without warning 3 nights later, hammering against the rooftops of Millbrook with a fury that rattled shutters and sent stray animals scrambling for cover. Grace lay awake in her bed, listening to the storm build outside her window, and found herself thinking not of the leaking roof or the animals she needed to check on, but of Cale, alone in that open cage, with nothing to shield him from the downpour. She could not shake the thought. Every crack of thunder made her wince, imagining him exposed to the elements, while the rest of the village slept safely beneath solid roofs. By midnight, she could no longer stay in bed. She dressed quickly, pulled on her heaviest cloak, and slipped out into the storm before she could talk herself out of it. The walk to the eastern pit had never felt so long. Mud sucked at her boots with every step, and rain lashed sideways, stinging her face and soaking through her cloak within minutes. By the time the cage came into view, she was drenched to the bone, but the sight before her made her forget the cold entirely. Cale sat pressed against the far wall of his cage, the only part offering even partial shelter from the storm. His massive frame curled tight against the relentless rain. Water streamed down his face and shoulders, and though he did not complain, the sheer exhaustion in his posture told Grace everything she needed to know. He had likely spent every storm in these conditions, year after year, with no one to notice or care. "Cale," she called, her voice barely carrying over the rain. His head lifted immediately, eyes finding her through the downpour, and something in his expression shifted from resignation to disbelief. "Grace, what are you doing out in this? Go home. This storm is dangerous." "So is sitting out here with no shelter," she shot back, moving closer to the bars despite the driving rain. "Why doesn't anyone give you cover? A roof? A tarp? Anything?" "Because kindness was never part of the arrangement," Cale said simply, though there was no self-pity in his voice, only a weary acceptance that had clearly calcified over years of neglect. The cage was built to contain, not to protect. Grace felt anger flare in her chest, hot and sudden, directed not at Cale, but at the village that had allowed this cruelty to continue unquestioned for so long. She thought of the warm fires burning in every house behind her, of neighbors who complained about minor discomforts while living, feeling being suffered, exposed to every storm without shelter. "That's not right," she said fiercely. "Nobody should have to endure this." "Grace," Please, go home, Cale urged again, though his voice had softened, touched by something that sounded almost like affection beneath the concern. I do not need you catching your own death out here on my account. But Grace was already moving, searching the area around the cage with newfound determination. Near an old storage shed used for tools nobody bothered to maintain, she found a length of heavy canvas, the kind farmers use to cover hay bales during harvest season. It was far from perfect, but it was something. She dragged it back to the cage, arms straining under its weight, and began working it through the bars, draping it over the section of the cage where Cale sat, angling it to block the worst of the wind and rain. You do not need to do this, Cale said, watching her efforts with an expression Grace could not quite read in the darkness, somewhere between gratitude and disbelief. I know I don't need to, Grace replied, breathless from the effort, rain streaming down her own face now, as she secured the canvas as best she could against the bars. I'm doing it because you deserve better than this, whether the rest of the village agrees or not. When she finally finished, exhausted and soaked through, she stepped back to examine her work. It was crude, and it certainly would not hold against the worst of the storm, but it was already providing some measure of shelter, enough that Cale could shift beneath it and find partial relief from the relentless downpour. Thank you, Cale said quietly, and the simple sincerity in his voice struck Grace harder than she expected. You don't have to thank me for basic decency, she said, though her cheeks warmed despite the cold rain, and she was grateful the darkness hid the color rising in her face. They sat together for a while after that, Grace huddled just outside the bars beneath the edge of the canvas, Cale graciously allowed to extend toward her as well, sharing the small shelter she had created. The storm raged around them, but for the first time, Cale did not seem entirely alone in enduring it. Can I ask you something? Grace said eventually, watching lightning flash across the distant hills. Of course. Do you ever think about what you'd do, if you were free? If the cage just disappeared tomorrow? Cale was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same careful weight he seemed to give everything. I used to dream of returning home, he admitted, rebuilding what was lost, finding whatever remains of my people, and helping them recover from everything the war destroyed. And now? Now I do not know if home exists anymore, Cale said, and there was a rawness to his voice that made Grace's chest ache. It has been so long. Perhaps everything I remember is already gone, turned to dust and forgotten history. Perhaps the only thing waiting for me beyond these bars is more of the same fear I have always known. Grace considered his words carefully before responding. I don't think that's true, she said. I think fear only wins when nobody's brave enough to question it. Look at what you told me the other night. Everything I believed about you was wrong, and it only took one conversation to change that. If it worked for me, maybe it could work for others too. Cale's eyes met hers, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the rain filling the silence between them with its steady rhythm. You are unlike anyone I have encountered in a very long time, Grace Turner, he said finally. Is that a compliment? She asked, a small smile tugging at her lips despite the cold. The highest one I know how to give, Cale replied, and something in the warmth of his tone sent a different kind of warmth spreading through her chest, chasing away some of the chill from the storm. They remained together beneath the makeshift shelter until the worst of the rain passed, talking quietly about small things now, favorite foods, half-remembered childhood memories, the simple pleasures that made up an ordinary life. It struck Grace, as the storm finally began to ease into a gentle drizzle, how easily their conversation had shifted from the weight of Cale's past into something lighter, something that felt almost like the beginning of an actual friendship rather than a cautious negotiation between fear and curiosity. By the time she finally rose to make her way home, the sky beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn, Grace felt a certainty settle over her that had not been there before. Whatever the village believed about the caged giant at the edge of town, she now knew the truth well enough to stand firmly against it. I'll come back tomorrow, she promised, gathering her soaked cloak around her shoulders, and I'll bring something better than canvas for next time. You do not have to keep doing this, Cale said, though the hope in his voice betrayed how much he wanted her to anyway. I know, Grace said simply. That's exactly why I will. As she made her way back through the muddy paths toward Willow Lane, the first golden light of dawn breaking over the horizon, Grace found herself smiling, despite her exhaustion. She thought of Cale's careful hands, his rough but gentle voice, the quiet dignity he carried even after years of unjust suffering. She thought of the canvas shelter, imperfect but meaningful, and the way his eyes had softened when she refused to simply walk away from his discomfort. She did not yet know how the village would react if they discovered what she had done, sneaking out during a storm to shelter the very creature they feared most. She did not yet know how many more nights like this one lay ahead of them, or how much more of Cale's story remained to be told. But she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she had found something precious in that cage, something worth protecting, no matter what challenges awaited them both. The rain had washed away more than just the mud from the village paths that night. It had washed away the last of Grace's doubts, leaving behind a clear and unshakable resolve to see this friendship through, whatever the cost might turn out to be. A week passed before the first cracks began to show in Grace's careful secrecy. It started with something small, a comment from her brother Nathan over breakfast, tossed out casually between bites of porridge. "You've been sneaking out at night," he said, not looking up from his bowl. "I heard the door 3 times this week." Grace's spoon froze halfway to her mouth. "I couldn't sleep," she said, forcing her voice into something light and unconcerned. "I've been walking to clear my head." Nathan glanced up at her then, his expression more curious than accusing, though there was a sharpness in his eyes that told Grace he was not entirely convinced. "Walking where, exactly?" "Because old man Percy said he saw someone near the eastern pit a few nights back. Said it looked like a girl about your size." Grace's stomach dropped, but she kept her face carefully neutral. "Percy's eyesight isn't what it used to be," she said, spooning porridge into her mouth, to avoid saying anything more incriminating. Nathan did not push further, but the seed of suspicion had been planted, and Grace knew she would need to be more careful. She could not risk anyone discovering the truth before she was ready, before she had found a way to make the village understand what she now knew about Cale. That evening, as she made her way toward the cage under the cover of a moonless sky, she found herself glancing over her shoulder more than usual, checking the shadows for any sign of Percy, or anyone else who might report her movements. The village had eyes everywhere, and secrets rarely stayed buried for long, in a place as small as Millbrook. When she finally reached the cage, she found Cale already waiting near the bars, as though he had somehow sensed her approach before she arrived. It had become a small ritual between them, this quiet anticipation, and Grace found herself looking forward to it more each day. "You seem troubled tonight," Cale observed as she settled onto her usual stone seat. "My brother's getting suspicious," Grace admitted, unwrapping the small parcel of food she had brought. "Someone saw me near here a few nights ago. I don't think anyone knows for certain yet, but it's only a matter of time." Cale's expression grew thoughtful, and Grace could see the concern etched into his weathered features. "Perhaps you should stop coming," he said quietly, though the reluctance in his voice made it clear the words cost him something to speak. "I would not want you to face trouble on my account." "I'm not stopping," Grace said firmly, surprising herself with the certainty of her own conviction. "I've thought about this. If people find out, I'll deal with it, but I'm not going to abandon you, just because it might be inconvenient for me." Something in Cale's expression softened at her words, gratitude mixed with an old, familiar worry that Grace had come to recognize whenever he feared for her safety more than his own. "You are a stubborn woman, Grace Turner," he said, though there was clear affection beneath the words. "So I've been told," Grace replied with a small smile, passing the food through the bars. They settled into their usual conversation, but Grace could tell something was different in Cale's demeanor that night, a restlessness beneath his usual calm. Eventually, as the moon climbed higher above the trees, he spoke again. "I want to tell you something," he said, "about my people, and what happened to them after I was captured." Grace straightened, giving him her full attention. In all their conversations, Cale had spoken of the war, of the betrayal that led to his imprisonment, but he had never fully explained what became of his people afterward. "When I was captured," Cale began, his voice low and measured, "the armies that defeated us scattered what remained of the kindred across the surrounding lands. Some were killed outright, deemed too dangerous to be allowed freedom. Others were driven into hiding, forced to abandon everything they knew rather than risk the same fate as their king." "Do you know if any of them survived?" Grace asked softly. "I do not know for certain," Cale admitted. "But sometimes, on quiet nights, I imagine I hear whispers on the wind. Rumors carried by travelers who pass near this place. Stories of giants living quietly in the mountains far to the north, keeping to themselves, avoiding contact with the smaller folk who once hunted them. Do you believe those stories are true? I want to believe it, Kale said. I want to believe that some part of my people survived, that the war did not erase everything we built together. But hope is a dangerous thing to carry in a place like this. It is easier, sometimes, to assume the worst and protect myself from further disappointment. Grace considered his words carefully, feeling the weight of the loneliness he had carried for so long. Not just the physical isolation of the cage, but the deeper isolation of not knowing whether anyone from his old life remained to remember him. What if I helped you find out? She said suddenly, the idea forming even as she spoke it aloud. I could ask around, talk to traders who pass through the village, see if anyone has heard anything about giants living in the north. Kale's eyes widened slightly, surprise evident in his expression. Grace, that could draw dangerous attention. If anyone realized why you were asking such questions, it would only add to the suspicion already forming around you. I'll be careful, Grace promised. I won't mention you directly. I'll just ask general questions, the kind of thing anyone might be curious about. Traders love sharing stories, especially strange ones. It shouldn't raise any alarms. Kale studied her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his pale gold eyes. Gratitude tangled with worry, hope tangled with fear, of that same hope being crushed. Why do you care so much? He asked finally. You have already done more for me than anyone in years. Why continue to risk yourself for someone the entire village believes to be a monster? Grace met his gaze steadily, considering how best to answer a question that had been building inside her own heart for weeks now. Because I don't think you're a monster, she said simply. I think you're someone who lost everything, through no fault of your own, and who has been punished for it ever since. And I think everyone deserves the chance to know whether there's still something worth hoping for, even after everything's been taken from them. Kale was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried an emotion Grace had not heard from him before, something raw and unguarded. Thank you, he said simply, for seeing me as something more than the story everyone else believes. Grace smiled, feeling the warmth of the moment settle over her despite the cool night air. That's what friends do, she said. They look past the stories and see the truth. As she made her way home that night, her mind already turning over ideas for how she might discreetly gather information from the traders who occasionally passed through Millbrook, Grace felt a renewed sense of purpose settling over her. She was not naive enough to believe the search would be easy, or that answers would come quickly. But for the first time since she had begun visiting Kale, she felt as though she were doing more than simply offering comfort within the confines of his cage. She was actively working to give him something he had not possessed in years, hope for a future beyond these bars. She did not yet know that her search would soon lead her into far more danger than a few pointed questions to passing traders, or that the truth about Kale's scattered people would prove far more complicated and far more urgent than either of them could have anticipated. The trading caravan arrived in Millbrook on a bright, clear morning, 3 wagons loaded with goods from the Northern Territories, drawn by weary horses, and led by a broad-shouldered merchant named Oliver Bennett. Grace had heard about the caravan's arrival from her mother the night before, and she had spent the hours since planning exactly how she might approach the traders without arousing suspicion. She found her opportunity in the early afternoon, when the market had grown crowded enough that a young woman asking casual questions would blend easily into the general noise and bustle. Oliver's stall was stacked with furs and unusual trinkets, items that suggested his travels had taken him far beyond the typical trade routes most merchants followed. Beautiful furs, Grace said, running her fingers over a thick pelt that looked unlike anything native to the forests surrounding Millbrook. Where do these come from? Oliver glanced up, offering her a friendly, weathered smile. Mountains up north, miss. Cold enough up there to freeze the breath right out of you, but the animals grow the thickest coats you've ever seen. It sounds like quite a journey, Grace said, keeping her tone light and conversational. Do you travel through the mountains often? Often enough, Oliver replied, folding another pelt for a nearby customer. Strange territory, though. Not many settlements up there. Mostly just scattered folk who prefer to keep to themselves. Grace's pulse quickened, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. What kind of folk? she asked, feigning idle curiosity as she examined another item on his stall. Oliver shrugged, though something flickered across his face, a hesitation that suggested he had more to say than he was initially willing to share. All sorts, I suppose, though there are stories, if you believe that sort of thing. What kind of stories? Giants, Oliver said, lowering his voice slightly, as though the word itself carried weight. He was not entirely comfortable speaking aloud in public. Not the kind from old tales meant to frighten children. Real ones, or so travelers claim, living quietly in the higher valleys, avoiding contact with anyone who isn't one of their own. Grace's heart pounded so loudly she was certain Oliver must be able to hear it. Have you seen them yourself? She asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. Once, from a distance, Oliver admitted. Years back, on one of my earlier trips north. Saw a group of them moving through a valley at dusk, tall as trees, moving with more grace than you'd expect from creatures that size. Gave my whole party quite a fright, though they never approached us, just watched from afar and let us pass. Do you think they're dangerous? Grace asked. Oliver considered the question seriously. Can't say for certain. Never heard of them attacking anyone unprovoked, though the stories do tend to exaggerate things. My guess is they simply want to be left alone, same as anyone who's suffered enough to distrust the world around them. Grace filed away every word, her mind already racing ahead to how she might share this information with Cale. Here was confirmation, or at least the beginning of it, that some remnant of his people might still exist, hidden away in the northern mountains, choosing isolation over the risk of facing the same fate that had befallen their king. That's fascinating, she said, forcing herself to sound casually interested, rather than desperately invested. Do you know exactly where in the mountains they might be found? Oliver studied her for a moment, a flicker of curiosity crossing his weathered face. Why the sudden interest, miss? Not many folk around here ask about giants without some particular reason. Grace's mind raced for a plausible explanation. My grandmother used to tell stories, she said, the lie coming more easily than she expected, about giants, and kingdoms, and wars fought long ago. I suppose I've always wondered if any of it was true. Oliver's expression relaxed slightly, apparently satisfied by her explanation. Can't blame you for wondering. Truth is, I couldn't tell you exactly where they settled. Somewhere in the higher valleys past the frozen river, though the terrain up there shifts more than most maps can keep up with. Dangerous country, even without giants to worry about. Grace thanked him for his time, purchasing a small trinket to justify the length of their conversation, before making her way through the rest of the market with her mind spinning. She had confirmation now, however uncertain, that Cale's people might still exist, scattered but surviving in the mountains far to the north. The question now was how, and whether, to share this information with him, and what it might mean for both of them, if the possibility of reunion became something more than distant hope. She returned to the cage that evening, earlier than usual, unable to contain her excitement long enough to wait for full darkness. Cale's eyes brightened the moment he saw her approaching, quickly followed by concern, at the urgency evident in her hurried steps. Grace, is something wrong? He asked immediately. No, nothing's wrong, she said, slightly breathless from the walk. I spoke to a trader today, someone who travels through the northern mountains regularly. Cale went very still, understanding immediately what her words might mean. And? He's seen them, Grace said, unable to keep the excitement from her voice despite trying to remain measured for Cale's sake. Giants, living in the higher valleys, keeping to themselves. He said they seemed peaceful, that they never approached his caravan, just watched and let them pass. For a long moment, Cale said nothing at all, his expression a complicated mixture of hope and disbelief, as though he were afraid that speaking might somehow shatter the fragile possibility Grace had just presented to him. You believe this could be true? He finally asked, his voice rough with an emotion Grace had never heard from him before. I don't know for certain, Grace admitted honestly, but it's more than we had yesterday. It's a start, Cale. A real possibility that some of your people might still be out there. Cale's hands gripped the bars of his cage, and for the first time since Grace had begun visiting him, she saw tears gathering in his pale gold eyes, tears he seemed to be fighting against with everything he had. I had convinced myself it was safer not to hope at all. Well, now you don't have to, Grace said gently, reaching through the bars to rest her hand against his massive forearm, a gesture that had become increasingly natural between them over the past weeks. "We'll figure out what this means together." Cale looked down at her hand against his arm, and something shifted in his expression, a vulnerability he had clearly kept carefully guarded until this moment. "Grace, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." "Of course," she said. "If there is truly a way to reach them, a way to find what remains of my people, would you help me find it? Even knowing what it might mean, that I might eventually need to leave this place, leave Millbrook, leave—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Leave you?" Grace's chest tightened at the question, at the unspoken weight behind it. She had not allowed herself to consider fully what finding Cale's people might mean for their own friendship, for whatever this connection between them had grown into over these past weeks. But looking into his eyes now, she understood with sudden clarity that helping him find his people, even at the cost of his eventual departure, was the only choice she could make and still call herself his friend. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the ache building in her chest. "Whatever it takes, whatever it means for us, you deserve the chance to find your people again. I won't stand in the way of that." Cale's hand covered hers gently, careful of his own strength as always. "Thank you," he said softly, "for everything. For the food, for the shelter, for believing in a possibility I had almost given up on entirely." As Grace finally made her way home that night, her heart carried a strange mixture of joy and sorrow. Hope for Cale's future tangled together with an unexpected ache at the thought of what that future might eventually cost her. She did not yet know how difficult the path ahead would prove to be, or how many obstacles still stood between Cale and any chance of freedom, but she knew, with unwavering certainty, that she would face every one of those obstacles alongside him, for as long as he needed her. The suspicion Grace had feared finally caught up with her on a cool evening nearly 2 weeks later, and it arrived in the worst possible way. She had grown careless, or perhaps simply confident, believing that her careful routine of late-night visits had gone unnoticed by anyone beyond her brother's passing comments. She had not accounted for old man Percy's failing eyesight being compensated by his sharp memory, nor for how quickly rumors could spread through a village as small and tightly knit as Millbrook once someone decided to give voice to their suspicions. It was Mrs. Whitfield who confronted her first, catching Grace just as she left her house for what she believed would be another quiet, unremarkable evening. "I know where you've been going," Mrs. Whitfield said without preamble, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression a mixture of concern and barely contained anger. "Percy's seen you 3 times now, sneaking toward the eastern pit like some kind of thief in the night." Grace felt her stomach drop, but she forced herself to remain calm, to think quickly. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, though even to her own ears, the denial sounded weak and unconvincing. "Don't lie to me, child," Mrs. Whitfield said, her voice sharpening. "I've known you since you were small enough to fit in my arms. I can tell when you're hiding something. Have you lost your mind entirely? That creature could kill you without even meaning to, simply by existing too close to something as fragile as you." "He's not a creature," Grace said before she could stop herself, the words escaping in a rush of frustration and protectiveness. "His name is Cale, and he's kinder than half the people in this village." Mrs. Whitfield's eyes widened, shock and horror crossing her weathered features in rapid succession. "You've been talking to it? Feeding it? Grace Turner, do you have any idea what you've done? Do you understand what could happen if the council learns of this?" "What could happen?" Grace shot back, anger rising to meet her fear. "He's been chained in that cage for years, exposed to every storm, fed on nothing but rumors and cruelty, and nobody in this entire village has questioned whether that's actually justified. I have questioned it, and I've learned the truth. He's not the monster everyone believes him to be." "You don't know that," Mrs. Whitfield insisted, though her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "You've spent a few weeks talking to something you barely understand, and suddenly you believe you know better than generations of warnings passed down specifically to keep people like you safe." "Maybe those warnings were wrong," Grace said firmly. "Maybe fear got passed down, instead of truth, and nobody bothered to question it, because questioning it seemed too dangerous." Mrs. Whitfield stared at her for a long moment, clearly torn between genuine concern for Grace's safety and something that looked almost like uncertainty at the conviction in the younger woman's voice. The council needs to know about this, she finally said, though there was less anger in her tone now, replaced by a weary resignation. Whether you believe your creature is safe or not, this isn't a decision you can make alone, Grace. It affects the whole village. Please, Grace said, panic creeping into her voice despite her efforts to remain composed. Please don't say anything yet. Give me a chance to prove that he's not dangerous. Give me a chance to show everyone the truth before they make a decision based on nothing but old fear. Mrs. Whitfield hesitated, studying Grace's desperate expression for a long moment. I'll give you 3 days, she finally said. 3 days to figure out how you're going to explain yourself to the council. Because I promise you, child, I am not the only one who has noticed your absences. Someone else will speak up soon enough, whether you're ready or not. Grace nodded, gratitude and terror warring within her chest in equal measure. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me, Mrs. Whitfield said, already turning to walk away. Just be careful. I've known that cage held something people feared for as long as I've been alive. I hope, for your sake, that your faith in this creature proves justified. Because if you're wrong, Grace, the consequences will fall on far more than just yourself. Grace stood frozen in the darkening evening, long after Mrs. Whitfield disappeared back toward her own home, her mind racing through every possible scenario, every way the coming days might unfold. 3 days. She had 3 days to figure out how to convince an entire village to reconsider years of ingrained fear, to see Cale as she saw him, rather than as the monster their stories had made him into. She made her way to the cage that night with a heaviness in her steps that had not been there before, dread settling over her despite the familiar comfort of the path she had walked so many times in recent weeks. Cale sensed her distress immediately, his expression shifting to concern the moment she came into view. Grace, what's happened? Mrs. Whitfield knows, Grace said, the words tumbling out in a rush. About us. About my visits. She's given me 3 days before she takes it to the council. Cale's face fell, worry, and something that looked distinctly like guilt crossing his weathered features. This is exactly what I feared, he said quietly. I never should have allowed you to keep visiting, to keep risking yourself for my sake. Don't say that, Grace said fiercely, moving closer to the bars, despite her exhaustion. This isn't your fault. This is the village's fault, for building an entire culture of fear around something they never bothered to understand. But it is you who will suffer the consequences, Cale said, and the pain in his voice was unmistakable now. If the council decides I am too dangerous, they may not simply punish me further. They may punish you as well, for daring to defy their warnings. Grace considered his words, and though fear coiled tight in her stomach at the thought, she found her resolve only strengthening rather than weakening. Then we need a plan, she said firmly. We need a way to show them the truth, something undeniable enough that even the most stubborn elders can't dismiss it. Cale studied her for a long moment, clearly torn between his own protective instincts and the practical necessity of her suggestion. What did you have in mind? Grace thought carefully, turning over every possibility in her mind. What if the council saw for themselves? What if they came here, watched how you actually behave, rather than relying on stories that are decades old and likely exaggerated beyond recognition? You would risk bringing the entire council here to confront me directly? Cale asked, clear apprehension in his voice. I don't see another option, Grace said honestly. If we hide, if we pretend nothing has happened, they'll only grow more suspicious, more convinced that we have something dangerous to conceal. But if we're honest, if we show them exactly what I've witnessed these past weeks, maybe, just maybe, we can change their minds before fear makes the decision for them. Cale was quiet for a long moment, considering the enormous risk inherent in her proposal. Finally he nodded, though the tension in his shoulders remained visible even in the dim moonlight. If this is the path you believe we must take, then I will trust your judgment, Grace. You have proven wiser than I expected in matters concerning your own people. Then we have 3 days to prepare, Grace said, though even as she spoke the words, uncertainty gnawed at her about whether 3 days would be nearly enough time to overturn a lifetime of ingrained fear. 3 days to figure out exactly how to convince an entire village that everything they've believed for years might be wrong. As she finally made her way home that night, exhaustion weighing heavily on her despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins, Grace found herself praying, in whatever quiet way she still remembered how to pray, that her faith in Cale would prove strong enough to withstand whatever the coming confrontation might bring. She had come too far now to turn back, and whatever happened next, she intended to stand firmly beside the giant the village had feared for so long, whatever the cost might ultimately prove to be. The 3 days passed in a blur of anxious preparation. Grace spent every spare moment considering how best to present her case, rehearsing arguments in her mind, trying to anticipate every objection the council might raise. She barely slept, her thoughts constantly circling back to the confrontation that awaited her, and to Cale, waiting patiently in his cage, for whatever judgment the village elders would ultimately deliver. On the morning of the 3rd day, word arrived that the council had agreed to Grace's request, largely due to Mrs. Whitfield's unexpected advocacy on her behalf. They would gather at the eastern pit that very evening, 5 elders representing the interests of the entire village, to observe the caged giant firsthand and determine, once and for all, what should be done about the situation Grace had created. Grace spent the day in restless anticipation, unable to focus on her usual chores, her mind constantly drifting toward the evening ahead. Nathan, having finally learned the full truth of her secret visits, oscillated between concern for her safety and a grudging curiosity about the giant his sister had apparently befriended. "Are you certain about this?" he asked as evening approached, watching her pace nervously around their small kitchen. The elders aren't known for changing their minds easily, especially not about something they've feared for as long as most of them have been alive. "I have to try," Grace said, though her own confidence felt increasingly fragile the closer the confrontation drew. "If I don't, they'll make their decision based purely on old fear, and Cale will suffer the consequences of a judgment that was never fair to begin with." Nathan studied his sister for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, a reluctant respect emerging beneath his earlier concern. "You really believe in him, don't you? Not just as some pet project or curiosity, but genuinely believe he deserves better than what he's been given." "I do," Grace said simply, "more than I've believed in almost anything else in my life." As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and purple, Grace made her way toward the eastern pit, her heart pounding with a mixture of determination and dread. She arrived to find the 5 council elders already gathered near the cage, their expressions ranging from cautious curiosity to outright hostility. Elder Whitfield, Mrs. Whitfield's husband and the most senior member of the council, stood at the forefront, his weathered face set in stern lines as he watched Grace approach. "Miss Turner," he said formally, "you understand the gravity of what you've asked us to consider tonight." "I do," Grace replied, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the nervousness churning in her stomach. "And I believe, once you've truly observed him, you'll understand why I've come to see him so differently than the stories suggest." The elders turned their attention toward the cage, where Cale sat quietly, his posture carefully non-threatening, his pale gold eyes watching the gathered group with an expression of guarded hope. Grace could see the tension in his shoulders, the effort it clearly took him to remain calm under such intense scrutiny. "It looks exactly as dangerous as the stories describe," one of the other elders muttered, an older woman named Beatrice, her voice thick with suspicion. "Size alone should be enough to convince any sensible person that creature does not belong anywhere near innocent villagers." "Size isn't the same as danger," Grace said firmly, stepping forward despite the elder's obvious skepticism. "I've spent weeks visiting him, talking with him, learning about who he actually is, rather than who your stories claim him to be. He's shown me nothing but kindness and patience, even when every instinct might have told him to lash out at the fear surrounding him. And you expect us to trust the word of a young woman who has clearly become emotionally attached to something she barely understands?" Elder Whitfield asked, though his tone carried more genuine curiosity than outright dismissal. "I don't expect you to simply trust my word," Grace replied. "I'm asking you to trust your own observations. Watch him. Speak with him, if you're willing. Judge for yourselves whether the creature standing before you matches the monster your stories describe." A tense silence fell over the gathering, as the elders exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unprepared for the possibility of directly engaging with the very thing they had feared for so long. Finally, Elder Whitfield stepped closer to the bars, his expression carefully neutral despite the obvious effort it took to maintain his composure. "Do you have a name?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. Cale's eyes widened slightly. clearly surprised by the direct engagement. "Cale," he said, his rough voice carrying clearly across the small distance separating them. "And what would you say to those who fear you, Cale?" Elder Whitfield continued, apparently deciding to test the waters of genuine conversation. "What would you say to convince us that decades of caution have been misplaced?" Cale considered the question carefully before responding, and Grace found herself holding her breath, praying he would find exactly the right words to bridge the enormous gap of fear and misunderstanding that separated him from the gathered elders. "I would say nothing," Cale finally replied, surprising everyone present, including Grace. "Words are easy to doubt, especially from someone your stories have already condemned. Instead, I would ask you to consider this. I have been caged here for years, exposed to every storm, fed only when someone finally chose kindness over fear. I have had every reason, every opportunity, to lash out in anger and confirm every terrible thing you believe about me. Yet I have not. Ask yourselves why that might be, if I am truly the monster your stories describe." The elders fell silent, clearly unsettled by the quiet dignity in Cale's response, so different from the raging violence they had likely expected. Beatrice, the older woman who had spoken earlier with such certainty, studied Cale with a slightly less hostile expression now, though skepticism still lingered clearly in her eyes. "Stories don't emerge from nothing," she said, though her voice carried less conviction than before. "There must have been some truth to the original fear, some reason our ancestors chose to cage you in the first place. There was a war," Cale acknowledged, his voice steady despite the painful subject matter. "A war born from misunderstanding and betrayal, not from any desire on my part to harm those who had done nothing to deserve it. I have paid for that war, with years of imprisonment, years of isolation, years of being defined entirely by fear, rather than by anything I have actually done since being caged here. I do not ask you to forget the past. I ask only that you judge me by my actions in the present, rather than by stories that have grown more exaggerated with each passing year." Grace watched the elders carefully, trying to gauge their reactions, hope and anxiety warring within her chest, as she waited to see whether Cale's words had made any real impact on their deeply ingrained beliefs. The silence stretched long and uncertain, broken only by the soft rustle of evening wind through the surrounding trees. Finally, Elder Whitfield turned to Grace, his expression thoughtful rather than hostile. "This is not a decision we can make lightly," he said. "But I will admit, Miss Turner, that what we have witnessed tonight does not align entirely with what our stories have long claimed. We will need time to discuss this properly among ourselves." "Thank you," Grace said, relief flooding through her despite the uncertainty that still remained. "That's all I'm asking for, a fair chance for the truth to be heard." As the elders departed, their expressions still troubled, but noticeably less hostile than when they had arrived, Grace turned back toward Cale, catching the cautious hope flickering in his pale gold eyes. Whatever the council ultimately decided, something significant had shifted that evening, a crack finally forming in the wall of fear that had surrounded Cale for so many years. Whether that crack would widen into genuine change, or simply close again under the weight of old habits, remained to be seen. But for the first time since this entire journey began, Grace allowed herself to believe that real change might actually be possible. The council's deliberations stretched across 2 agonizing days, during which Grace was forbidden from visiting the cage while the elders debated the matter privately. She spent those days in a state of restless anxiety, imagining every possible outcome, torturing herself with worry over how Cale must be faring alone, with no one to bring him food or comfort. On the evening of the second day, Elder Whitfield arrived at her family's door, his expression grave enough that Grace's stomach dropped the moment she saw him. "The council has reached a decision," he said without preamble, "though I suspect it will not fully satisfy either side of this debate." Grace's heart pounded as she waited for him to continue, dread and hope warring within her in equal measure. "We are not prepared to release the creature," Elder Whitfield said carefully. "Not yet, not without further evidence that the peace he has shown remains consistent over time. However, we have also agreed that continuing to deny him basic shelter and adequate provisions, given what we witnessed of his character, would be a cruelty we can no longer justify." Relief flooded through Grace. though it was tempered by disappointment that full freedom remained out of reach. "What does that mean, practically?" she asked. "It means proper shelter will be constructed for him," Elder Whitfield explained. "Regular provisions will be provided, overseen by the council rather than left to chance or individual charity. And you, Miss Turner, will be permitted to continue your visits, though under certain conditions, designed to ensure the safety of all involved." "What conditions?" Grace asked warily. "A guard will be posted nearby during your visits, at least initially, until the council feels fully confident in the situation," Elder Whitfield said. "This is not meant as an insult to either of you, but simply a reasonable precaution given the circumstances." Grace considered the terms carefully. It was not the full freedom she had hoped to secure for Cale, but it represented genuine progress, a real shift away from the cruel neglect he had suffered for years. "I accept," she said finally. "Thank you, Elder Whitfield, for giving this a fair hearing." "Do not thank me yet," the elder said, his expression still troubled. "There remains significant opposition within the council, and within the village more broadly. Not everyone shares the openness you witnessed the other night. Beatrice, in particular, remains deeply unconvinced, and she carries considerable influence among those who share her caution." Grace nodded, understanding the precariousness of the situation, despite the progress achieved. "I'll do everything I can to prove that this trust is well placed," she said. True to the council's word, construction began the following day, on a proper shelter within the cage, a simple wooden roof, extending over a portion of the enclosure, sturdy enough to withstand the region's frequent storms. Grace watched the work with quiet satisfaction, though she noticed the wary glances several of the workers cast toward Cale throughout the process, old fear still lingering beneath their reluctant cooperation. Cale, for his part, remained carefully deferential during the construction, offering quiet thanks to each worker, despite their obvious discomfort in his presence. Grace could see how much restraint this required of him, how carefully he modulated every movement to avoid triggering the fear that still simmered just beneath the surface of the village's grudging tolerance. That evening, once the workers had departed, and the promised guard had settled into a watchful position at a respectful distance, Grace finally had the chance to speak with Cale properly again. "You handled everything today with remarkable patience," she said, settling into her familiar spot near the bars. "I have had years of practice controlling myself under difficult circumstances," Cale replied, though there was a weariness in his voice that suggested the effort had taken a genuine toll. "Still, this is progress, however imperfect. I am grateful, Grace, for everything you have done to make this possible." "We're not finished yet," Grace said firmly. "This is just the beginning. Full freedom is still the goal, even if it takes longer than either of us would prefer." Cale studied her for a long moment, something tender crossing his weathered features. "You have already given me more than I ever expected to receive again," he said quietly. "Shelter, food, companionship, and now the beginning of genuine consideration from people who once saw me as nothing but a threat to be contained. Whatever happens from here, I will always be grateful for what you have already accomplished on my behalf." Grace felt her cheeks warm at the sincerity in his words, an emotion she had been carefully avoiding examining too closely, blooming fully in her chest now. "I care about you, Cale," she said softly, the admission feeling both terrifying and inevitable, after everything they had shared these past weeks. "Not just as a project to prove the village wrong about, but as someone whose well-being genuinely matters to me." Cale's expression shifted, vulnerability and hope mixing together in a way Grace had rarely seen from him. "I care about you as well, Grace Turner," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "More than I believed myself still capable of caring about anyone or anything, given everything I have endured." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while after that, the weight of their mutual admission settling gently between them, rather than creating the awkwardness Grace had half expected. The guard remained at his post nearby, watchful but respectful, and for the first time, Grace allowed herself to imagine a future where this connection between them might continue to grow, without the constant shadow of village suspicion hanging over every moment. But even as that hope took root, a new concern began to nag at the edges of her mind. Beatrice's continued opposition worried her, the knowledge that not everyone in the village shared the openness the council had cautiously extended. She thought of the whispered conversations she had overheard among some of the townsfolk, conversations that suggested Beatrice was actively working to undermine the council's decision, gathering support among those still gripped by old fear. "I'm worried," Grace admitted eventually, breaking the peaceful silence between them. "Beatrice hasn't given up. I can feel it. The way certain people look at me differently now, the whispers that follow whenever I walk through the market." Cale's expression grew serious, concern for her replacing the earlier tenderness. "You believe she intends to challenge the council's decision?" "I don't know for certain," Grace admitted. "But I know fear doesn't disappear just because a few elders decided to give you a fair hearing. If anything, that fear might be growing more desperate, more determined to prove itself justified, before it loses its grip entirely." Cale reached through the bars, his massive hand covering hers with careful gentleness. "Whatever comes, Grace, know that I am grateful beyond words for everything you have risked on my behalf. If Beatrice succeeds in turning the village against this fragile peace we have built, I do not want you to blame yourself for the outcome." "I won't let that happen," Grace said with quiet determination, though uncertainty gnawed at her even as she spoke the words. "We've come too far to lose this now." As she made her way home that night, the weight of Beatrice's continued opposition pressing heavily on her thoughts, Grace found herself praying that whatever challenge lay ahead would not undo everything they had worked so carefully to build. She did not yet know how soon that challenge would arrive, or in what form, but she could sense, with the same instinct that had first drawn her to Cale's cage all those weeks ago, that the true test of their fragile progress was still to come. The storm arrived without warning, on a night that had begun peacefully enough, the sky clear and star-filled when Grace first made her way toward the cage for her evening visit. By the time she reached Cale, however, dark clouds had begun rolling in with alarming speed, and within the hour, the wind had picked up into a violent howl that sent loose debris scattering across the village. "This looks like it's going to be bad," Grace said, watching the sky darken further, the new wooden shelter above Cale's section of the cage creaking ominously under the strengthening wind. "You should return home," Cale said immediately, concern evident in his voice. "This storm feels different from the others we've weathered together, more violent." Grace hesitated, torn between her instinct to stay and the growing danger of the worsening weather. Before she could decide, a tremendous crack of thunder split the sky directly overhead, followed almost instantly by a downpour so intense it felt like standing beneath a waterfall. "Go, Grace," Cale urged again, more forcefully this time. "Please, I will be fine. The shelter should hold, even in weather like this." Reluctantly, Grace turned to make her way home, but she had taken only a few steps when a sound like the world tearing apart echoed through the village, followed by screams, carrying faintly on the wind, from the direction of the town center. "What was that?" Grace gasped, spinning back toward Cale. Cale's expression had gone sharp with alarm, his enhanced senses clearly picking up on details Grace could not fully discern through the storm. "Something has happened," he said urgently. "Something serious. I can hear it. Structures collapsing. People in distress." Grace's heart raced as she strained to hear anything beyond the howling wind and pounding rain. Then, carried faintly but unmistakably, she heard it too. More screams, and beneath them, the terrible sound of splintering wood and crumbling stone. "I need to go see what's happening," she said, already turning to run toward the village center. "Grace, wait," Cale called after her, and something in his voice made her pause. She turned back to find him gripping the bars of his cage with an intensity she had never witnessed before, his powerful frame straining against the iron restraints. "Whatever has happened, I could help, if given the chance. Please, if there are people in danger, do not let fear keep them from accepting whatever aid I might offer." Grace hesitated only a moment before nodding, understanding immediately what needed to happen. She sprinted toward the guard post near the cage, finding the young guard sheltering as best he could from the storm. "There's been some kind of collapse in the village center," she shouted over the wind. "People might be trapped. Cale could help, if you'll release him." The guard's eyes widened with uncertainty, clearly torn between protocol and the urgency of the situation. "I don't have authority to release him," he protested. "The council would need to approve something like that." "There's no time for that," Grace insisted. "People could be dying right now, while we debate authority. Please, I'll take full responsibility for whatever happens." The guard hesitated only a moment longer before making his decision, fumbling with the heavy lock that secured Cale's chains. The moment the restraints fell away, Cale moved with a speed that belied his massive size, sprinting toward the village center with Grace struggling to keep pace behind him. They arrived to find chaos. A large section of the old grain storage building had collapsed under the weight of the storm, trapping several people beneath the wreckage, their cries for help barely audible over the continuing downpour. Villagers gathered helplessly around the debris, unable to shift the heavy timber and stone without proper equipment or sufficient strength. Cale did not hesitate. He moved directly toward the largest section of collapsed roofing, where the cries for help sounded most desperate, and began lifting away debris with a strength that left the gathered villagers staring in stunned disbelief. "There, beneath that beam," someone shouted, pointing toward a section where a child's cries could be heard, muffled but unmistakably terrified. Cale moved immediately, carefully lifting an enormous timber that would have required a dozen strong men to shift under ordinary circumstances, revealing a small girl trapped beneath, frightened but miraculously unharmed. He gathered her gently in his massive arms, handing her carefully to her sobbing mother, before turning immediately back to the wreckage to continue his search. Over the following hour, Cale worked tirelessly through the storm, pulling 3 more villagers from the collapsed building, each rescue accompanied by growing astonishment from the crowd that had gathered to watch. The very creature they had feared for years, the monster their stories had painted as a threat to everyone's safety, was now the only reason several of their neighbors remained alive. Elder Whitfield arrived partway through the rescue effort, his expression shifting from initial alarm at seeing Cale freed from his cage to something approaching awe as he witnessed the giant's tireless efforts on behalf of the very people who had imprisoned him. "How is this possible?" he murmured, more to himself than to anyone in particular, watching Cale carefully extract another survivor from the wreckage. Beatrice arrived shortly after, and Grace watched her expression carefully as the older woman witnessed the scene before her, expecting to see the same suspicion and fear that had characterized her earlier opposition. Instead, Grace saw something far more complicated crossing Beatrice's weathered features, a dawning recognition that everything she had believed for so long might have been fundamentally wrong. By the time the rescue efforts finally concluded, the storm beginning to ease into a gentler rain, Cale stood in the village center, exhausted but unharmed, surrounded by grateful villagers who could no longer deny what they had witnessed with their own eyes. The child he had first rescued, no more than 6 years old, approached him hesitantly, still clutching her mother's hand. "Thank you," she said, her small voice carrying clearly in the newly quiet aftermath of the storm. Cale knelt down carefully, bringing himself to something closer to her eye level, despite his enormous size. "You are very brave," he told her gently. "I am glad you are safe." The girl's mother, tears still streaming down her face, looked up at Cale with an expression of profound gratitude mixed with lingering disbelief. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You saved my daughter's life." "No thanks are necessary," Cale replied. "I only did what anyone would have done, given the ability to help." Elder Whitfield stepped forward then, addressing the gathered crowd with a voice that carried clear authority, despite the emotion evident beneath his words. "Tonight, this village has witnessed something that challenges everything we believed we understood about the creature we have kept caged for years," he said. "I believe it is time we reconsider, as a community, exactly what kind of future we wish to build with him, rather than continuing to define him by fears that tonight has thoroughly disproven." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Grace felt tears of relief and joy mixing with the rain still dampening her face. She looked toward Cale, finding his pale gold eyes already fixed on her, exhaustion and hope mingling in his exhausted expression. Whatever challenges still remained ahead, Grace understood in that moment that everything had changed. The village that had feared Cale for so long had witnessed, undeniably, the truth she had known for weeks now, and nothing, she suspected, would ever be quite the same again. In the days following the storm, Millbrook transformed in ways Grace could scarcely have imagined possible just weeks earlier. The council convened an emergency session, and this time, there was no need for lengthy persuasion or careful demonstration. The entire village had witnessed Cale's heroism firsthand, and even the most stubborn skeptics found themselves unable to maintain their old fears in the face of such undeniable evidence. Elder Whitfield addressed the full council with quiet conviction. "We have kept a being of remarkable character caged for years, based on fear and stories that time has proven exaggerated beyond recognition," he said. "Last night, he risked his own safety, worked tirelessly through a dangerous storm, and saved the lives of 4 of our people, without hesitation or expectation of reward. I believe the time has come to correct the injustice this village has perpetuated for far too long." Even Beatrice, who had fought so hard against any consideration of Cale's release, found herself unable to argue against the truth she had witnessed with her own eyes. "I was wrong," she admitted quietly during the session, her voice carrying genuine humility Grace had never heard from her before. "I let old fear cloud my judgment, and I nearly cost this village the chance to know someone who has proven himself far more honorable than most of us could claim to be." The council's decision, when it finally came, brought Grace to tears of overwhelming relief. Cale would be released, fully and without restriction, his chains removed permanently, the cage that had confined him for years finally dismantled. The village would offer him a place to live among them, should he choose to stay, along with a formal apology for the decades of unjust imprisonment he had endured. When Grace brought the news to Cale, finding him still resting near the ruins of his former prison, she could barely contain her joy. "They've decided," she said, breathless with excitement. "You're free, Cale, truly free." Cale's expression shifted through disbelief, cautious hope, and finally overwhelming emotion, as the reality of her words settled fully into his understanding. "Free," he repeated softly, as though testing whether the word itself might shatter under too much weight. "After all these years, I hardly know how to comprehend it." "You don't have to comprehend it all at once," Grace said gently, taking his massive hand in both of hers. "You just have to start living it, one day at a time." The formal ceremony marking Cale's release took place 3 days later, the entire village gathering in the town square as the last of his chains were removed. Grace stood beside him throughout the proceedings, her hand resting reassuringly on his forearm, as villagers who had once feared him now approached hesitantly to offer their own words of apology and gratitude. The little girl he had rescued from the storm presented him with a small handmade token, a carved wooden bird crafted by her own small hands. "For being brave," she said solemnly, and Cale accepted the gift with a tenderness that brought fresh tears to Grace's eyes. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Cale turned to Grace, something serious and searching in his expression. "I have spent so many years dreaming of this moment," he said, "imagining what freedom might feel like, wondering what I would do the instant these chains finally fell away. But now that it has happened, I find myself uncertain of only one thing." "What's that?" Grace asked softly. "Whether freedom means as much to me now, if it means leaving you behind," Cale said, his voice carrying a vulnerability that made Grace's heart ache with tenderness. "I still hope to search for my people, to learn whether any remnant of my kingdom survived the years of exile. But I find I cannot imagine that journey without you beside me, Grace Turner." Grace felt her breath catch, joy and hope blooming fully in her chest as she considered his words. "Then don't imagine it without me," she said simply. "I told you from the beginning, whatever this journey required, I would face it alongside you. That promise hasn't changed just because you're finally free." Cale's expression softened into something profoundly grateful, and slowly, carefully, he drew her into a gentle embrace, his massive arms surrounding her with a tenderness that spoke volumes about the gentle heart the village had so thoroughly misjudged for years. "Then let us discover together," he said quietly. "Whatever the future holds, whether it leads us to the mountains in search of my scattered people, or simply toward a quiet life here, among those who have finally learned to see me clearly." In the weeks that followed, Millbrook slowly adjusted to its new reality, learning to coexist with the giant they had once feared, watching as he took an active role in rebuilding the storage building damaged during the storm, contributing his considerable strength toward projects that benefited the entire community. Children who had once been warned to stay far away from the eastern pit now approached him freely in the market, curious and unafraid, drawn by the gentle patience he showed toward even the smallest and most persistent of their questions. Grace watched this transformation with quiet satisfaction, remembering the frightened girl who had first crept toward that cage in the dead of night, armed with nothing but a loaf of bread and a curiosity she could not fully explain. She had not known then how completely that single act of kindness would reshape not only Kale's future, but her own as well, and the future of an entire village that had finally learned to question the fear it had carried for far too long. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant colors over the peaceful village, Grace and Kale sat together near the site of the old cage, now nothing more than scattered stones, slowly being reclaimed by the surrounding grass and wildflowers. "Do you ever regret it?" Grace asked quietly. "All those years, everything you endured before I first found you here?" Kale considered the question thoughtfully, before responding. "I cannot say I do not wish those years had been different," he admitted honestly. "But I also cannot regret the path that eventually led me here, to this moment, beside you. Perhaps every difficult chapter serves some purpose, even if we cannot always see it clearly, until we have finally reached the other side." Grace leaned against him, feeling the steady, comforting warmth of his presence beside her. "Whatever comes next," she said softly, "I'm glad we found each other." "As am I," Kale replied, his voice filled with a contentment that had been entirely absent from his life for far too long. More than words can properly express. Above them, the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, and for the first time, in longer than either of them cared to remember, neither Kale nor Grace felt even the slightest trace of fear about whatever the future might still hold. They had faced the weight of old prejudice and ancient fear together, and they had emerged not just intact, but stronger, bound together by a friendship that had blossomed, against every expectation, into something neither of them had ever anticipated finding. The village that once caged an innocent giant out of fear had finally learned the deeper truth Grace had understood from that very first night, that kindness, however small it might seem in the moment, possesses the power to break even the strongest chains and to transform the deepest fear into something far more powerful and far more lasting: understanding.